Hi, good afternoon. My name is Laura Kelley. I am chair of the Miami-Dade Democratic Party, and I am here with candidate for Congressional District 27, Robin Peguero. Thank you so much for being here, Robin. I do want to give a quick disclaimer that being on this podcast is not support or endorsement for any particular candidate. We've had another candidate for CD27 here a couple of weeks ago, and have invited the third Democratic candidate here as well. But again, we want to support our candidates, provide that even level playing field, and also make sure we are learning more about everybody who's running for 2027. So, 2026, not 2027. Yeah, 27 and 26.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So, Robin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This is a pleasure. So I, have done public service my whole life, and that always, I go back to my parents. They're the ones who instilled that in me and inspired me to do that because they're immigrants to this country. My father from the Dominican Republic and my mom from Ecuador. And the first thing they did upon getting to this country was enlist in the U.S. Army. So that, incredible sacrifice and service was my sort of guiding light throughout all my life to choose public service at every point. So that's why I became a homicide prosecutor here in this community, living in this district, trying to make sure that our streets are safe and defending and protecting victims from, violent crimes. Again, my specialty was homicide. And I also became a lawyer on the January 6th committee. And I did that also because I wanted to help defend democracy. So I have experience going toe-to-toe with President Trump. And so I think, prosecuting the case against Maria Elvira Salazar is going to be a piece of cake compared to that. And so, I grew up in Hialeah, Florida. My parents raised me in a working class family. My father ultimately became a school teacher, a Spanish school teacher in the public school system here in Miami-Dade. My mom became a mail carrier, and both proud union members. And I know what it's like, what American families are going through, because I've lived that experience. I've lived paycheck to paycheck. I've had us crammed into a one-bedroom apartment, all four of us. I've had us have to, sit at the kitchen table and figure out how we're going to pay our bills. And my parents were able in a generation to emigrate from a country, come here where they didn't know the language. They worked hard. They were able to afford a home, and they were able to provide a life for me and my sister and send us off to college, to law school. I ultimately was so fortunate to be able to go to Harvard College and Harvard Law School. And I worked my way through both of those, doing work study with financial aid. And I want that same opportunity for American families. It's out of grasp, unfortunately, right now. Yeah. Later and later are people waiting to be able to buy a home. Later and later are people being able to feel financially secure in their jobs. And it's because, costs are way too high, salaries are way too low. And Salazar promised that was what she was going to focus on. And instead, she's focusing on taking away our health care, right? And standing by while the president deports hardworking, tax-paying immigrants. So I'm running to make sure that we can fix that, we can change that and get her out of, the way, because she's not representing our community.
Right. And this is a powerful moment to take back Congress, take back the Senate, so that we can have a stopgap against what the administration is doing. And almost it seems like he has a blank check to do whatever he wants. It's like, I was fortunate enough to see Justice Sonia Sotomayor here on Friday, and she talked about separation of powers and co-equal branches of government. It feels right now that we don't have that the executive believes, and some of his supporters believe, that the executive is a king and can do whatever he wants. And that is not the case. We have, you don't have to go to Harvard to know that, right? That we learned that in like 7th grade civics.
Absolutely.
There is and that's on the naturalization exam as well, that there is a separation of powers, co-equal branches of government. And someone like Maria Elvira Salazar, who had the opportunity to be to use her leverage to stop this terrible bill that was recently passed, that takes away people's support systems, that has essentially, like I said, given a blank check to the Trump administration to create this enforcement operation that is the largest law enforcement agency in the world, specifically to detain and deport, as you mentioned, hardworking immigrants to the tune of 3,000 individuals every single day. Yeah. She squandered that opportunity to use her leverage, and we're seeing, in my opinion, the Congress just roll over and at least on the Republican side, the majority, roll over and let him do whatever he wants.
Yeah. Well, look, she has a soft spot for dictators. She always has. She fawningly talked about Fidel Castro, calling him comandante from that interview.
Oof, yeah.
And here she is again, sort of voting in complete lockstep with the president, and not really standing up for the community in any way. So we have a closely divided House, as you rightly mentioned. That vote of hers is worth a lot, right? She could have gained some sort of concessions for our community, either in that bill, right? Instead, 100,000 people will wake up one day without their Affordable Care Act, without their Medicare, without their Medicaid. That's people in my district, in my community, 100,000, 1.9 million in Florida overall, right? So she's voting for that. She's voting to do it on the backs of the middle class and giving tax giveaways to billionaires and corporations. So we know whose side she's on in that way. And instead of, again, trying to get either some sort of concession from the president in terms of his immigration policy, right? We have Cubans, we have Venezuelans, for the first time being ensnared in, his deportation hysteria, taking away their privileges, taking away their TPS, talking about how Venezuela is super dangerous, right? Narcotraficantes in Venezuela, so much so that he's, killing traffickers on boats, right? Extrajudicially,
I was gonna say
judicially doing that.
Right, extrajudicial killings. That's making a decision to essentially bomb a boat without any due process whatsoever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do that and claim that Venezuela is so incredibly dangerous and that gives you the power to do that, how could you possibly sit around and say we got to send back Venezuelans to that country and say it's safe for them to go back? It obviously isn't. And so the Congresswoman is not using her power whatsoever, completely ceding power to the president. She calls him Lincoln, right? She says he's going to be the Lincoln on immigration, going to do for immigration what Lincoln did for slavery. That's preposterous. That's insane. I don't even understand the analogy. But otherwise, it's completely ridiculous. And we need a congressperson who's going to actually enjoy the job again. I don't quite understand why she does it if she doesn't want to do her job. To be just a rubber stamp for the president, that's not really a congressperson, right?
Right. Or coming on programs. I know she was on Glenna Milberg's show a couple weeks ago or a week ago, talking about TPS. And I'm like, why are you talking about TPS? The president has taken people who had lawful status, people who were here in status with work permits, paying taxes, gainfully employed, consuming in our communities, and making them undocumented, essentially. And to me, it's so disingenuous for her to argue that she supports TPS, she supports Venezuelans, she supports Cubans, Nicaraguans, and other nationalities, when she is literally doing nothing to prevent them from being, as you said, ensnared in this deportation machine.
Mm-hmm.
And while people are being taken to places like, was Alligator Alcatraz, Deportation Depot, but also in Texas, there are state-run facilities where we don't know where people are. They're not getting access to counsel. And that is extremely disconcerting.
For sure.
Especially when somebody has, like you said, that one vote gives her a lot of power. Not to mention the two other votes that we have from South Florida. The three of them together could wield a lot of power for our community, but they have chosen not to.
If they cared, I think they've forgotten about the community. They're so afraid of showing up anywhere, right? She's not doing town halls. She's not in our community. She's not even going to the Republican parts of the district because she's afraid of any questioning. She's afraid that there'll be a viral moment. I mean, I think when politicians get to the point where they care more about protecting their seat than they actually do standing up for their fellow man, their citizens, their community, then we've gotten to a bad place where they need to be kicked out of office. And so I think, it's a moral issue for me. It's personal for me as a son of immigrants. But we got to, also talk about the economic issue of it all, right? Because this is potentially bottoming out our agricultural sector, our construction sector. These are folks who have contributed so much to this economy. They pay their taxes. The vast majority of them, 85% and upwards, have no criminal history whatsoever. And these are the people that President Trump is targeting and that Maria Elvira Salazar is allowing him to target. That is going to, if we're talking about rising costs, imagine the cost of our groceries, of our fruits and our vegetables, if we keep sending back these folks who have given so much to this country and are propping up so much of our economy. So we got to not only talk about it as a moral issue, but it's a pocketbook issue. And she promised that she was going to focus on the economy, on rising costs. And instead, what do we got? We got costs that are still rising. We've got unemployment that is now rising too. We're heading, head straight into a recession. This is insanity.
Absolutely. I mean, I woke up to the news today that the dollar has lost 14% of its value since the inauguration day. And we're seeing, the impacts of tariffs on rising prices.
Yep.
Again, she's not standing up against that. We see, you mentioned the economic impact of this immigration issue. And the fact is, it's not, as you mentioned, we're losing people who work hard in our communities where they're not able to work. They're being detained at taxpayer expense. So we're paying for them to be detained and ultimately deported. They're sending people when they can't deport them to their home countries, to third countries like South Sudan or Uganda, where there's death penalty for homosexuals. It boggles the mind truly as to what's happening in this country and why our leaders aren't standing up to them. It's very frustrating to see this happen, and I'm sure that that's part of the inspiration why you decided to run for Congress.
Absolutely. What we're talking about, I just think the government needs to get back to the basics, and what it needs to do is help the middle class, right? It needs to protect its citizens from enemies, both foreign and domestic, right? As a homicide prosecutor, I did that for 7 years, right? And then it needs to help the middle class, right? It needs to give middle class relief. It doesn't need to give tax relief and tax giveaways to billionaires and corporations, right? So I have two examples of how rising costs are really, bringing working class people down, right? And as someone who grew up with that, right, who knows that lived experience, I know how difficult it can be. I'm still, dealing obviously the same way with everyone else with rising electricity costs, right? This summer, through the roof, right? Our bills getting way, way, way too high. And this is a monopoly here in the state,
yes,
FP&L. And they're now, with that rising cost, introducing, hey, let's have the highest rate hike in history right now, right? And the Congresswoman has said absolutely zero about it, right? And again, it's because she's voting to give them tax giveaways and tax breaks. So whose side is she going to be on? Is she going to be on the consumer, or is she going to be on the side of big corporations, right? We already know. Okay. And they're funding her campaign. She's one of the top 10 in the House in terms of GOP candidates who have received money from FP&L lobbyists.
Wow.
So we know why she's being silent, because she's so concentrated on keeping her seat that she can't see past that, right? The other rising cost that I really wanted to talk about, because this is insane. The one thing that is actually decreasing in cost is cocaine.
Oh my God.
And the reason cocaine is decreasing in cost is that between the ports of entry, which is where cocaine has been flowing in, right? Fentanyl, when we were so concerned, the Republicans were so concerned, right, about the border, which we absolutely do need to secure. But what they're doing is diverting resources from between those ports of entries. Federal agents are now being taken and put into our cities, like here in Miami, so that we can round up people.
In court.
Exactly. Round up folks and deport them and put them through zero due process, all of that. That diversion has made drugs flow more into this country. And because of that, the price of those drugs, including cocaine, has dropped. That shows you where their priorities are, right? We need to secure the border. We need to make sure that we're limiting the import of drugs so that people, our family members aren't swept up in that addiction and aren't hurt and killed because of it. That's where we should be concentrating our efforts. We should be concentrating our efforts in terms of deporting violent criminals. Again,
absolutely.
Folks who hurt people in our community, who kill, right? That was my job for 7 years, to make sure that those people were held to account and put in jail. Those people have lost their privileges to be in this country, but those are far and away the vast minority of the folks who are being deported or being ensnared in these sweeps, in these ICE sweeps. These are folks who are good folks, who are hardworking, who are tax paying and have no criminal history, and they should not be lumped in together with the folks who are hurting our community.
Absolutely, and the Maria Elvira Salazar likes to tout her the
Dignity Act.
The Dignity Act, exactly, the Dignity Act, which does not allow these hardworking individuals to have a path towards residency or towards citizenship. And we see right now what happens when people have temporary status that doesn't give them a path towards residency or a direct path towards residency or citizenship. That means that at some other point, somebody can take this away. Yeah. It could be a new Congress in the future, a new executive, and it's so disingenuous. Obviously, she's not using her leverage to even get that passed, or the Venezuelan Adjustment Act.
Mm-hmm.
And again, same issue that the Cubans are having that are recent arrivals, that they don't have a lawful entry to even utilize the Cuban Adjustment Act. I heard her once say in a program that the Biden administration created the famous I-220A, and that is absolutely not true.
No.
That was actually created during the Trump administration
right.
and utilized during the Trump administration. It was, again, used during the Biden administration. But she has an opportunity to make, again, use her leverage to speak to the president to make sure that people can adjust status, get some lawful status here in the United States that gives them a permanent path forward. And she's not doing that.
Yeah, she has a poor grasp on facts. Outside of that, she will say one thing in Washington and say something completely different in our community, if she's talking at all, because she's mostly been silent and hiding. But yeah, she speaks out of both sides of her mouth, right? And again, because she's so afraid of losing power. And there are more important things than your seat in Congress, Congresswoman, right? There's integrity. They're standing up for what's right. We also, as Democrats, we got to make sure that we have an affirmative message, right? This is absolutely a referendum on the incumbent. She absolutely deserves to be fired because she refuses to do her job, and we need somebody there who's going to do her job so that we can provide, great things for the people in our community, right? We should be raising the minimum wage. We should be making sure that we're building more affordable housing units, right? We should be implementing, maternity leave, right? And universal pre-K and funding our public education systems. So I also want to let people know that, yes, they're doing horrible things, and we need to take back the House in order to stop them, to limit the damage of what they're doing to this country. But we also have an affirmative plan, an affirmative message for why you should vote for us. And it's because we actually care about middle-class families and making sure that they can get by. And so there's so many things that we can do if we have power to get back in there and really provide for middle-class families as opposed to billionaires and corporations.
Absolutely. And I think we learned, or we should have learned, in the 80s that trickle-down economics does not work. Giving tax breaks to the corporations and billionaires does not trickle down to the middle class. It does not trickle down to the people who need it. You mentioned the Affordable Care Act, and that you're from Hialeah. Hialeah has one of the highest, I know that's not your district, but it's relevant to, I know you mentioned you have a lot of people in your district that do rely on the Affordable Care Act and subsidies within the Affordable Care Act. Hialeah has one of the highest concentrations of people who use subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. And this one piece of legislation has allowed so many people to have health care that never had health care before. And this is one of the issues that is coming up for what may be a government shutdown come October 1st. And the question is, are our Congress people going to stand up for the Affordable Care Act subsidies that allow people to have their health care? Do you have anything to say about that?
Absolutely. Look, we can't continue to bail out the Republicans from their worst instincts. They are in charge of the government. They're in charge of all levers of the government, both houses of Congress and the White House, right? If they refuse to stand up for middle-class families, and in so doing, bring on a government shutdown that will hurt people, that will keep them from getting their Social Security checks, that will keep them from vital resources and programs that they rely on, then that's on them. Right? We got to keep fighting for the people who we represent, and not, again, be the adults in the room always trying to save the Republicans from, really driving this country into a ditch, right? People need to see what it looks like to be under Republican rule, and what they actually care about and what they don't. And so those folks in Hialeah and in my community who are dependent on the Affordable Care Act, who are dependent on their Medicare and Medicaid, we cannot take that away from them. These are people's lives. Right? This Republican Congress that Maria Elvira Salazar is gambling with. And it's so awful and it's so unfortunate. One thing I want to say is, this is a capitalist country and it needs to remain that way. And I'm so happy with the virtues of capitalism in terms of what it can provide, the jobs it can create. I think that billionaires who have worked so hard and are investing in this economy and creating jobs, they deserve, to earn what they earn, right? That's the blessing of America. The American dream was that, again, from one generation, my parents came with just the clothes on their backs and they were able to send their kids off to law school to become lawyers. And we all want for our future generations to do better than the generation before us, right? That doesn't mean that they need tax breaks, right? They just got to pay their fair share of taxes. That's all. But they absolutely should keep their money. They absolutely should be rewarded for what they're putting into the economy. And instead, what we have socialism, reverse socialism, right? The Congresswoman voted for a bill that redistributes income, right, from the poor to the rich. That is what it's doing, right? And we also have a government, we have a president who is investing government resources in stake, right? Intel stake, 15%, and also buying stake in a private mining company. The government controlling private business, that is socialism, and I'm opposed to it. And unfortunately, Congresswoman Salazar, again, zero to say when the government is buying private business, buying a stake in private business. It's insane.
I mean, this is right out of the Venezuelan playbook of the state ownership of, for example, the petroleum industry. How far is it going to go? Are we going to, have state ownership over the mining industry? I mean, again, there's so many accusations that the Republicans have used against Democrats, saying that we're communists. I'm a business owner. I mean, a small business owner, but a business owner. It's sad to me that we even have to say, like, we are not communists, we're not socialists. Having a strong social safety net, such as things like Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP benefits, the Affordable Care Act, making sure that people are protected at a bare minimum. And also, as we see costs continue to rise, people need this support in order to continue to maintain a lifestyle so that they can eat, send their children to school, continue working, be healthy enough to work. We have a consumer-driven economy. Without workers, without consumers, our economy cannot prosper. And it seems like everything they're doing is contrary to a prosperous economy for everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the message of the last election. It was, we need you to focus on the economy. We need you to focus on rising costs, right? They've done anything but. We have, as you mentioned, tariff on, tariff off one day. You don't know if a car is going to cost you $15,000 more one day to the next, right? These sorts of things are hurting our economy. We're being driven into a recession. We're having rising unemployment. And to add insult to injury at that moment, to take away people's healthcare on top of it, is really a travesty. It's really, it's just bad governing. And what we need are folks in there who are serious about bringing us all together. We're all in this together. We just want folks to be able to pay their fair share of taxes, people who are billionaires, who are corporations, so that we can fund the things that are keeping our economy going, keeping our workers going. The market is great, and the market responds and helps, right? And so when we have a monopoly like FP&L trying to introduce a rate hike, right? When we have folks who are, taking advantage of the market and leaving apartment buildings or apartments empty, right? Where we're not building the sort of affordable housing units we need to drive down the price of homes. Like, the market is good and right and it works, but we got to get out of our own way first. And we got to make sure that the people have the ability to spend money, to participate in the economy, and to grow their families and protect their families and hopefully build wealth. And that's what it's all about. That's what we got to focus on.
Workers, wage, wealth, right? And those are, from Westmore. This is so fundamental. And that's what we want. Everyone wants to contribute. They want to work. They want to get a fair wage, and they want to salir adelante. They want to go. They want to move forward and help their children, like you said, have a better life than they did for themselves. And unfortunately, we see over time that our children end up having less opportunity than we did, and less opportunity that our parents did. I want to talk to you. You mentioned monopolies. So it's not just FP&L that's a monopoly. We see media monopolies right now. Things going on with the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, and some of the crackdowns on free speech, really driven by the executive branch, like the FCC, and private businesses going along with it because they have to merge, right? Create, have more of a monopoly in order to make more money. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say about that. Like, how are you seeing the crackdowns on freedom of speech right now in in this great nation.
Yeah, as a lawyer and as a civil libertarian, right? I think it's awful. I think that, this was a great thing about the Republican Party is that they were always supporters of free speech. That was always, a part of the party plank, which is, I may not agree with what you have to say. It may be hateful speech. It may be nasty speech, but you have the right in America to say it. That's what distinguishes us from other nations around the world, that we have that First Amendment right. It was so important to the founders, and it's so important to our national culture. And that they've bent the knee now before this president and decided, okay, well, I guess freedom of speech isn't right what we're going to be isn't a core American value anymore because the president has his feelings get hurt. That's insanity, right? And even Maria Salazar, I think, feels her freedom of speech is curtailed, right? Because she feels like she can't come out against the president, right? She has to call him, dear leader, and she has to fawn over him as well, as opposed to, just say what you think, say what you mean, or do what you mean, and do what you say, right? And I think that unfortunately we've gotten to this point in this country where people are afraid. People are afraid to talk out, have their opinions be voiced, and that's just un-American.
Absolutely. Excuse me. And in that vein, we heard the president this weekend say that his opponents essentially are his enemies, and it's unfortunate that people like Maria Salazar, who have power, are not using the courage of their convictions to stand up for what they believe in. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned fear. And I think that it's everyday people are afraid to say what they think. I was out doing voter registration this weekend, and people said they felt a lot of fear. Fear to even wear a hat that says had the flag of their home country on it. Right. Fear to be out in the streets as a Black or brown person. Fear to speak their mind. And I think that, it's like they're getting their cues from the people in leadership like Maria Elvira Salazar, who don't have the courage to shoot straight with us, to speak to us, honestly and with integrity, and hide, not come out to their constituents, speak to their constituents, and have this open communication. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah, this is what it takes to do the job. And again, I don't. She's definitely not working for us, right? And we're paying the price, right? We're paying the price while she stands idly by, and we're paying the literal price, right? In terms of our checkbooks, our bills, right? With these mounting costs, while she does absolutely nothing and makes it even worse by voting in favor of the president's tariffs, right? Not limiting it, which again is an encroachment, right? Is usually the power of the purse and the power to declare war. All of those things that Congress used to defend as being the Article I legislative body, the first thing mentioned in the Constitution, right? The president isn't mentioned till Article II. That's the executive, right? So we know what the founders thought, who they thought should be sort of the catalyst, the where our bills should come from, right? Where our policy should move forward from. And unfortunately, they've, Maria Elvira Salazar and the rest of the Republicans have completely ceded all power to the president. And we just need checks and balances again. Then, folks who voted for Trump, even folks who voted for Salazar last time, what we need is our checks and balances. We need, again, to have, one of the houses of Congress, hopefully the House, maybe the Senate, have Democrats take over.
Why not both?
Why not both, right? Yeah, and absolutely. And I think we have an opportunity to do it. That's another thing that I want to basically instill in folks, not to give up hope, especially folks who are looking around at what's happening in our country and feel a sense of desperation. Maybe even people in Miami who have heard that, the Democratic Party here can't win, and that we should maybe turn our backs on those folks. We absolutely cannot and we should not. The people are starting to realize that this was not at all what they voted for, right? That they wanted a laser focus on the middle class and on the economy, and that's not happening, that they didn't want this sort of mass deportation, this kind of unsmart deportation. The president isn't being smart about who he deports and who he is not.
Not being strategic at all.
Absolutely not. And I think folks are realizing that, again, this is not at all what they wanted. And so this is the opportunity for us. We need strong candidates who, have had that lived experience of struggling day to day. I've gone to public schools my whole life. In Hialeah, I was a graduate of Barbara Goldman Senior High School. So I know the value of public schools because it's what created me and my sister. Again, I know the value of how hardworking immigrants, what they bring to this country because of my veteran parents, right, who served in this country for the first, couple of years that they were here. I know what it's like to balance a budget and have to worry about your bills because I've lived that, again, as a working class person. I want to make sure that we go to every corner of the district, the Republican ones as well. Yeah. They're not always going to agree, but I think a couple of them, if not a few, will say you're here, right? And you might win their votes, at least by just being there, by having the conversation, by being strong and courageous enough to face somebody you disagree with and to disagree politely and civilly, right? And we got to also meet voters where they are in terms of if they're getting their news from Telemundo, from Univision, from Spanish radio, right? As a Latino who grew up speaking the language with my parents, it's a joy for me to be able to speak the language and go already in my 2 months in the campaign on Telemundo, on Spanish radio, on several podcasts and web series hosted by prominent Venezuelans who are feeling like their community needs a voice and they need to hear the other side on those channels. And so I can speak authentically, right, to that experience because I've lived it. We got to speak to voters and meet voters where they are. And we absolutely have a chance to win this and flip this seat and the House with it.
Absolutely. And when we have those conversations, what we find out is that there's more that unites us that divides us.
Absolutely.
When one-on-one, we're not talking about the political polarization that exists on the extremes, especially as promulgated by our executive. And but when we have those conversations, those direct conversations, we learn about our values, about our integrity, and we're able to meet people where they are. And when we have those conversations, again, we discover there's more that unites us than divides us. Robin, there's so much more I wanted to talk to you about, and we are out of time.
Okay.
Can you please tell the listeners where they can learn more about you and your campaign?
Yeah, if they can go to pegueroformiami.com, sign up to volunteer, sign up to donate. We're 8 days away from the end of our first quarter, and so we'd love to have you on the team. Ponte las pilas and let's get to work.
Thank you so much for being here. Have a great rest of your week, everybody. Thank you, Robin, for being here once again.
Thank you so much.